Shalom Aleichem. As you should be able to see now on the screen, we are in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, L'Chukot HaGoyim, Perek Daled, Perek Revi'i, Halacha Yod Aleph. We are discussing the very unusual and unique reality and halacha pertaining to an Yud HaNidahath, which refers to a town where most of the inhabitants were incited and led astray and worshipped Avodah Zarah. And as we saw, such a town, if this is found to be the case, is put to the sword. Now, in Halacha Yud Aleph, it states as follows: Uven shehudaha kula, ben shehudahu ruba. If the facts are that all or most of the city worshipped Avodah Zarah, they're called the mudahim. Sokelim athmadihaha. Those who led them astray deliberately, who incited them and encouraged them and led the way, they are the madihim. They are killed by stoning. Kol shalala al toch rehava. All of the property of that place is brought to the town square. En la rehov or sim la rehov. If such a town square does not exist, a central place, such as the word place in English is, of course, cognate with and essentially identical with the Italian word Plaza, which of course is in English plaza, a central place, usually where the market took place and where other public activities were held. That is, it should usually exist. If it does not, it is created. If it has such a place outside its walls, so that place is included within the city boundaries. All living things, including animals, everything is destroyed. Everything is put to the torch. Now, we spoke about kula or ruba. It might be that there were some people in this town, shall we say 10% of them, 20% of them, who were not involved in this terrible crime. And they are referred to as the Sadiqim, the righteous within this city. What happens to their property? This is now Halacha Yud Bet that you should be able to see here. This refers, these Sadiqim are those who did not participate and were not led astray. Nisrafim bichlal shalala. Their property too is put to the torch. Ho'il uyashavu sham, seeing that they lived in this place, and the implication is that they should not have been living in such a place, because such things do not happen in a totally unexpected and unpredictable manner. Ho'ilu yashavu sham mamonam aved. Their property is forfeit. In other words, as the Mishneh in Masechet Avodah states at the beginning of Masechet Avodah, harhek mishachen ra, distance yourself, keep away from an evil or untempered, wild neighbor, a rasha, who wal tithabal rasha, the Mishnah goes on to say. So really, a good Jew had no place being in such a town. Again, such things do not happen out of nowhere, out of thin air. And they really are, they're responsible for the loss of their property because they could have moved. They could have moved away. As Rambam writes in Hilchot Yesodei Torah. Just a moment. I misspoke. I'm sorry. I meant I should have said Perek Shishi of Hilchot De'oth. And Rambam says here, let me bring this up. Just one moment. Rambam says here in Perek Shishi of Hilchot De'oth, דרך בריאתו של האדם להיות נמשך בדעתו ובמעשו אחר רעו וחברו. It is human nature, and even more than nature, it is the way that can you see the text or not? No. Okay, now you should be able to see it. It is the way, it's more than a kind of general inclination of people. It is derech b'ri'atho, it is hardwired into human beings to be influenced by and to emulate that which they see around them, their friends, their family, their neighbors, the society in general, how they behave. That is how most people will behave. And a person will almost always, with few exceptions, behave like others in his town, in his place. Therefore, thus, a person must always do their utmost to forge a connection between themselves and the righteous. The righteous, as we see here also in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, with regards to Ira. Anidahat refers to those who act and live in accordance with the Torah. They are tzaddikim. V'leshev etzel hachamim, and though the hachamim are not just regular tzaddikim, they're people who instruct and educate the tzaddikim to be such people. V'leshev etzel hachamim tamid, and to sit before the wise in the ways of the Torah. Kadesh yilmad mima'asehem, to learn not only their teachings but to their actions. V'yitrahek min harashaim ha'olechim b'choshech, and to distance oneself from those who do not live according to the Torah, by definition, Rashaim, ha'olechim b'choshech, who literally walk and stumble in the dark. Kadesh shelo yilmad mima'asehem, for the very same reason, not to learn from them. And one learns from everything, how people speak, how people dress, how people regard the world in general, or a specific topic or matter. As it says in Mishneh, he who walks and lives and finds himself within the circle of such people, he who walks with the wise, will become wise. And he who spends his time with the kesilim, empty, foolhardy people will also walk in a similar path. وَأُمِرْ as it says in Tehillim at the beginning, Ashrei ha'ish asher lo halach ma'asat rashrein. And Rambam continues and says, now this is halacha beth before you. וכן אם היה במדינה שמנהגותיה רעים. If a person finds himself in a town in which improper behavior is the norm, ואין אנשיה הולכים בדרך ישרה, and the inhabitants do not walk literally on the straight and narrow path of the Torah, בדרך ישרה, on the straight, proper path, ילך למקום שאנשיו צדיקים ונוהגים בדרך טובים. Person should pick up and go somewhere else, quite simply. No one is forcing him to remain there. ילך למקום שאנשיו צדיקים ונוהגים בדרך טובים. Go to a place where people are righteous, fear Hashem, and act accordingly. ונוהגים בדרך טובים. Act like the good, proper Torah Jews act. ואם היו כל המדינות שהוא יודע ען ושומע שמועתם. And if all the places with which he is familiar, נוהגים בדרך לא טובה. כמו זמננו זה, and if all places are cannot be described as a proper place, a place that the norms are Torah norms, as it is in our time, says Rambam. One can only begin to imagine what he would say about today. Or he's unable to go elsewhere to find a place where things are as they should be. Whether it's for reasons of political, military upheavals. Giyasot literally means armies. In other words, maybe there's a war in progress and he's unable to travel. Or for other reasons, he might be ill, maybe sick, old, feeble. Yeshev levado yehidi. It is better that he live alone as a hermit. Ka'inyan shene'emar yeshev badad v'idom. V'im hayu ra'im v'hata'im. She'en manihim otho leshev b'medina. And if this too is not possible, because the other people cannot bear such a person who wishes to be different, and even if he just wishes to be left alone, unless a person is willing to join them and act and be like them. If that is the situation, he should, even if necessary, flee to the desert, to live in a cave, wherever he might find shelter, rather than acquiescing to live and emulate as these people do, and to learn from them or act like them. As it says, I wish that I had a place, and the pasuk goes on to say, and I could, so that I could leave my people and leave them behind. Because they're all sinners, etc., etc. So it says Yirmiyahu. Some people might think that Yirmiyahu was a fanatic, but we do not think so. Torah people actually think that Yirmiyahu was on the money and knew something that other people did not know.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Could not all of these statements by the Rambam be taken to absolutely be supportive of the Haredi approach of staying far away from mainstream Israeli society, and even if we and furthermore, even if we just take as one issue alone the disgusting way in which many women dress in Israel, as in the West. Isn't that a sufficient reason? The question is two things. One, does this not prop up the Haredi position? And second of all, does it not even prop up the idea that we should be living in caves? In other words, where can you exactly run to where you're not going to be seeing these disgustingly clad women?
I do not know exactly to where one can run nowadays. Practically speaking, I think most of us are far less capable of living in caves or in the desert than in earlier times. I think we simply do not know how to live in such places, most of us, certainly. That's number one. But it is possible without actually moving into a cave. By the way, if this becomes a trend, then the caves will go up in price. They'll skyrocket. There'll be a tremendous market, a real estate market in distant caves. But the idea, the philosophy, the ideology which underpins these statements, as you indicate, is something that we should take to heart. Yes. If you ask me, can one see some connection between the Haredi approach and way of life to these statements here that we just read in the Rambam? I would say yes. You can see the connection. I've always felt that the Tilumi world has a very significant weak spot, and that is the not being aware of what we just read, what we just learned, not taking it to heart, perhaps because they're not sufficiently familiar with these ideas or such statements and such an ideology, and thus they tend to disregard such matters. It is possible, and I think this is what should happen. It is possible to create neighborhoods and towns and communities where people are able to control their environment more and have an impact on the society around them. It's not easy, perhaps, but it's possible. You need enough people who are very motivated and serious about doing such a thing. But it's possible. It also cannot be denied that, well, before I move on to that, I will add a few more points with regards to the correct approach. Torah Jews should wish, as Rambam also discusses here in Hilchot Avodah Zarah later, Perek Yud Aleph, we'll get there eventually, about not en olechim b'chokot hagoyim v'lo middamim lahem. lo b'malbush, lo b'se'ar. So a Jew is supposed to outwardly as well, in his dress, in his hairstyle, etc., is supposed to look different, be different from the non-Jewish society around him. And the same is true of a non-Torah society, which is populated mainly by Jews. So the idea that Torah Jews should dress differently from non-Torah Jews is entirely correct. And this is one, and such accepting upon oneself such a norm, a different style of dress, even if it's nothing to do with, sni'uth, but simply it's a kind of uniform or a badge, or it's a way of separating oneself, and looking and being different from the other crowd. That is a correct Torah idea. People who think it's not correct are mistaken. On this point, I think the Haredim are more correct than the Tilu'umi, or however you describe other types of Torah Jews. I think they're more correct. Does
Except
that
in the
mean
case, Rabbi. But
yes?
I suppose you could make an exception for those Datilumi Jews who, if you want to call them that, who do dress differently, such as Hilltop Youth.
Yes.
The Hilltop Youth certainly dress in a way that's
You're right.
distinguishable.
You're absolutely correct. I was just about to say that this does not necessarily mean that you have to dress in the classic Haredi style of dress in order to be different. That's not the only option. There are other options. Other options with regards to dress, hairstyle, kippah, you name it. There are all
Right.
kinds. Of
Right.
ways of looking and being different. And it's not. By the way, you don't even have to really go out of your way to do this, because the norm, so-called normal practices and standards and mores of most societies in which we find ourselves today, as Rambam wrote about his own time when he spoke about Kamo Zmanenu Zeh in Hilchot De'oth, as it is, he says, in his time, that most places are should be, if possible, should be avoided. So it's not that you have to go out of your way to be different. If you just act according to the Torah, you'll be different. You'll look different, without really having to make to focus on looking different. It'll work out that way quite naturally. If men and women dress correctly and properly, and do not make any effort to fit in with this or that fashion or style or norm, etc., etc. It's not only about dress, of course. Dress is something which is obvious and impossible to hide, and it's an expression of something more profound. But that's not the only thing, of course. And yes, I think this is a very serious discussion that the Tilumi world must engage in. It also must be said that there are definite shortcomings and problems that arise from the current mainstream, shall we say, Israeli Haredi model. Serious problems. One of which is, we could discuss this all day, but one of which is a general atmosphere of shall we say, not always being scrupulously honest or forthright in one's behavior with others. And this is a serious matter because there's such an atmosphere, such an attitude, then permeates the entire society. And this is something that we see. And just as the Tilumi people should be willing to see their reality for what it is, the Haredi world should also be willing to see its own reality for what it is. And it's far from perfect. So there's a lot, everyone has a lot of work to do, shall we say.
Rabbi,
Yes.
one question is regarding the issue of haircuts. I understand the idea of if the goyim have a certain hairstyle to try to be different in some way, but it seems like in the Haredi world, if we're going to focus on the Haredi world for a moment again, uh, it's not that just that maybe I'm missing something, but it's not just a matter of having a different hairstyle, it's having no hairstyle. In other words, it seems like if the mitzvah is to have a different hairstyle, that doesn't indicate that there should be no such thing as hairstyle. Maybe it even implies that there is such thing as a hairstyle. You simply shouldn't have the same hairstyle as the goyim, but with Haredim, it seems like there's no hairstyle. In other words, it's a total that just sort of leave your hair as it is and do nothing with it.
I'm not sure I'm following you. What do you mean by no hairstyle?
Well, basically, what does a hairstyle imply? That you're doing something with your hair, either combing it in a certain
Well, you can do
fashion.
two things with your hair. You can either occasionally go to the barber and have it trimmed, or you can let it grow wild. If you let it grow wild, then you essentially are behaving like a nazir or something like that. Is that possible? It's possible. Is it necessary? It's not necessary. Uh, if that's what you want to do, go right ahead. There's no specific hairstyle that the Torah mandates.
Right, there isn't anyone that mandates, but it seems, in other words, maybe I'm getting at a certain ascetic impulse. In other words,
I'm not sure I
having
understand.
no having no regard to one's.
The Haredim that I know go frequent the barber's shop as other people do, as I do, for example.
Right,
Uh,
but there's no such. In other words, there's no. Let's say in the non-Jewish world, there's okay over the generations, over the centuries, there's different ways of combing your hair and different ways of cutting your hair, but in other words, the Haredi approach would be just put a pot over your head and trim. In other words, there's no such thing as style. It's just
I don't think what you seem to be referring to as style, I don't think that's relevant or desirable at all when it comes to a man. And as for a woman, yes, there is more to discuss when it comes to style or fashion. But again, that it should not be uh, seen as emulating some foreign and strange hairstyle that might be common amongst other people. In general, men are not supposed to spend too much time on their appearance. Men do not wear makeup. Men are not supposed to dye their hair, etc., etc. These all fall within the category of not behaving like as women behave. The distinction the Torah makes between men and women, which we will discuss, applies to all these things.
Oh, another question I wanted to ask regarding the Dati Lumi world. It seems that I'm not sure if I missed that. You might have addressed this question. That the Dati Lumi world, some of it seems to have either an implicit or explicit philosophy that by us being implanted in all types of areas with a lot of other non-religious Jews, that we're having the effect of influencing them for the better. It's sort of like, for lack of a better way of like they're all like Chabad shlichim, but in a general type of community type of way. And we know that there's also the Garinim Toranim. That's a separate issue. That's I don't know if that's exactly the same thing, but it seems like many Datilumi will say, well, if we all live in our own areas, and the Chiloni will never see anything about religion, and they'll never have any way of learning about anything if we don't live in their areas. I don't know, wherever it may be in Rishon LeZion or Petach Tikva.
And perhaps that is why, according to current well-founded statistics, 50% of the younger generation in the Dati Lumi world cease to be Dati. That is the current statistic. I heard this recently, that figure. I assumed that was the figure. I have for some years. Some years ago, a certain rabbi wrote an article which I read, in which he spoke about 1/3. And at that time, I already said to myself, that's probably too low. I heard a certain individual by the name of Professor David Pasig. I don't necessarily agree with many of the things he says, but he's supposed to be a what's it called? I suppose a futurist. He deals with predicting and studying reality and past trends in order to understand what is likely to be in the future. In Hebrew, it's called an atidan. All right, fine, or hoker atidot, or all kinds of things, names and what have you. And I heard him say recently that in the Dati Lumi world is 50%, and then he added in the Haredi world is 20 to 30%. I thought that figure was. I was a little bit surprised how high that figure was. I assume he knows what he's talking about. So first of all, that proves that there's no simplistic and fail-safe solution and ideology which guarantees a certain outcome that does not exist.
But I think a substantial factor of the cell phones.
Even if that it could be that has to do with the cell phone, with the internet, with this or that, with all sorts of things. But rather than focus on a specific item of current culture or civilization, I think we should discuss the general principle, which is what we've been discussing. In other words, if the Dati Lumi world says to itself, we must live amongst others, non-Dati people, and we should also dress in a similar fashion, so that we will not be different and stand out and not be, as it were, it should not seem as if we are aiming to live apart. And thus we will be able to influence other people for the better. Well, as I just said, the facts are that it's the reverse. Usually the outcome is the reverse. It's much more likely that the Dati Lumi people will be influenced by Chiloni people rather than the reverse. And comparing them to Chabad, which is not something one should wish to be compared to under any circumstances, but comparing them to what Chabad does is completely spurious, because yes, it's true, Chabad engage in outreach and go and look for Jews and find them and try and speak to them and try them present them with a possibility at least of attending a Shabbat meal or whatever it might be. But how did they go about doing this? They do so whilst being dressed very differently. They have their own uniform, right? You can tell a Chabadnik from 100 meters down the road, correct? They have a uniform. They stand out. They're different. They wish to be different. They don't hide that fact. And when it comes to that attitude and that manner of being in the world, I think that many of us can take a leaf out of their book. We can learn something from Chabad. In other words, do I like their uniform? No, I don't. And do I like other things about Chabad? Absolutely not. But their willingness to on the one hand, interact with the world, but on their own terms, basically. In other words, we look different, we dress differently, we speak differently, we don't make any concessions to the other side when it comes. Yes, willing to come and talk to them, willing to try and influence them, but we don't do it in a manner which involves lowering our standards or being more similar to these other non-Torah people. And by the way, the Chabad approach too would not be agreed to by many Haredim, and is not. They would say that even that is too much connection and too much interaction, and is more likely to lead to certain major problems. And they may be right about that as well. But certainly the Dati Leumi world is a different, cannot claim to be acting as Chabad act. That's not true. It would be interesting, by the way, to note, to discover the statistical facts with regards to Garinim Toraniim in different places in Israel, where Dati Leumi people set up communities in regular non-Dati cities, shall we say. They set up a community, they have their maybe their own school even, and their own Bet Knesset, or what have you, and they try and influence the surroundings, and they do to some extent, which is precisely why the Meshumadim, the left, are so opposed to whatever they do, and that is what they try to hem them in on every side. But I don't know what the figures are. The younger generation from such communities, what is the outcome? I don't know. It's an interesting question. But it's different being a part of a Garin Torani, in other words, a self-contained and well-defined community, which usually has some rabbinical leadership, is different from just living amongst either non-Jews or amongst Hilonim. It's not the same thing, because you have a certain identity, you belong to a certain group, you have a certain frame of reference, and that provides a social, ideological foundation for running one's life. So I imagine that the outcomes there are much better. So I would imagine.
Rabbi, I would say that some just make an interesting point. Despite everything that you've said, we see the phenomenon of the overall population of Israel becoming, demographically speaking, growing all the time. The religious population is growing. And I think there also is a phenomenon of much of the secular population having a more traditional orientation than they ever had in previous decades.
That is true.
Some of them the opposite. So I would say that there's this interesting, what you would say in Hebrew, it's a davar v'hipucho. In other words, on the one hand, the Dati Leumi shouldn't be having this lovey-dovey, that's not the word, but such a desire to mix in with everybody all the time, and that's causing a lot of damage to the Dati Leumi world. But despite the fact that they shouldn't be doing it, but it could be that the fact that they are doing it is, by virtue of osmosis, having some effect on the Chiloni world. Not to mention all these datlashim that are dating Chilonim, and that also has its effect. So the influence goes both ways. So and on top of that, of course, there's another phenomenon on top of that, which is that the Sephardic world, which had been suppressed in the initial decades of the state's existence, are sort of now finding their way back to their natural inclinations, and I think that's also part of the reason the population has become more religious. So what's fascinating is that on the one hand, there's tremendous assimilation in the religious world, but because of all that I just said, and other reasons as well, and one very significant thing that I didn't mention, which is the birth rate, the Haredi birth rate, and perhaps to some extent the Dati Leumi birth rate, perhaps, that all of these reasons together are leading us towards a situation where there's more, every day we have a more clearly established religious traditional majority in Israel.
This is
And that
everything that you're describing is true and correct. Although we should be wary of assuming too much and thinking that we know exactly what the future brings, what the future will look like. Time is the great changer, changes everything, much more than many of us tend to realize or be aware of. I want to share something with you that I have here on the screen now. I will show you. This is an invitation that I received. As you can see, I didn't go because it's happening right now. It was this morning. But an invitation to a Tekes Kumta Beta Sefer Commando. All right. So this during this past night, this particular group of soldiers who are in what are considered special forces units, they had a night march. I don't know what length or distance, probably carrying tremendous amounts of equipment on themselves, on their backs. They walked all night. This is basically the end of their basic training, the first stage of their training only, and at which time they received their kumta, their berets. And this was this morning. So they walked on all night. They arrived to this place in Modi'in, as you see here. At 6:15 in the morning, there was a gathering there was families who wanted to participate and be there, showed up. At 6:45, the soldiers and their families could meet, and the official tekes, the ceremony where the soldiers are given their berets, and where those who excelled are given particular awards and citations, etc. That's at 8 o'clock. 8:30 to 9:30, Zman Chofshim HaMishpachot. That's the time set aside for mingling and socializing, etc., with the families and the soldiers. And you will note that it says here, B'sha'a sheva titkaim tefilat shaharit. At 7 o'clock, there will be a minyan for shaharit. Now, it's true. If this same invitation with the same units in the army had been printed and sent out, well, let's just say 20 years ago, certainly 30 years ago, and possibly even 10 years ago, it would not have said anything about shaharit at 7 o'clock. It just wouldn't have been mentioned. What does this tell you? Well, this tells you a number of things. It tells you that a significant proportion, I cannot give you the exact percentage, but a significant proportion, I would guess that it's over 50%. My semi-educated guess would be over 50% of the soldiers in these units who showed up at this park in Modi'in this morning, where this event took place, come from Dati families. And that's why it's only natural that there be a mention of Tfilat Shahri 7. That was not the reality a generation ago. I'm not sure about 10 years ago, 5 years ago, probably 10 years ago, maybe also. It's very obvious and very plain to see today. If I tell you that the number of soldiers killed and wounded in this current war thus far, thus far in Gush Etzion, which is not a very large number of towns or of yeshuvim overall. In Gush Etzion, the number of soldiers killed or injured is, according to one estimate, 17 times, and another estimate I heard 19 times more than the national average based on the relative size of the populace, etc. Well, that tells you something. It also tells you something if 60% or more, perhaps. Again, it's difficult to know precise figures, but I think it's generally recognized that the number of soldiers killed or injured in this current war from Dati families are, let's say, 60%. Well, that's at least double their proportion within the general populace, at least. The trouble is that people like Rav Eli Sadan, for example, Rav Yigal Levenstein, who set up the first Mechina K'dam Tzva'it at Eli. I remember when this took place. We're talking about over 40 years ago, because when I was in my early years, shall we say, also when I first got married, and I was studying in Yeshivat Merkaz Rav, Rav Eli Sadan was still studying in that yeshiva, and then he left, and they set up this Mechina Kedam Tzva'it in Erlin. And since then, many others have been founded. But Eli is the flagship, shall we say, of this operation. Now, what was the idea underpinning? Well, one of the ideas, not the only one, but one of the aims and the expectation was that if you have so many soldiers, Dati soldiers in the army, and particularly the officer corps, then eventually they'll just be promoted up through the ranks, and essentially they will become the dominant force and factor within the army. And that's a very fine theory, but it's not true, because the Meshumadim, the so-called what we should refer to as regressives, and the woke and the self-hating Jews, etc., they are not foolish. They're not stupid. They recognized immediately the danger, and they have managed successfully up to this point, which is over 40 years since these institutions were founded. They have produced tens of thousands of the best soldiers and officers, and yet not one of them has made it into the Matkal, into the general staff. That's not an accident. It's not because they weren't good enough. Quite the opposite. They were the best. Everyone knows that. For instance, this ex-general, Aluf Yitzhak Brik, totally secular, non-religious in every way, a painik of some type, one sort of another, but a very good soldier. He won an award for great courage in the Yom Kippur War, for example. And yet, because obviously he wasn't quite with the program, he became an aluf, he became a general, but he didn't go beyond that because he was blocked. This is what they do. He was obviously one of these people who actually believes that enemies should be killed, and that's not acceptable. So he says that the best fighting officer that the Israeli army has produced is Tataluf Ofer Winter. And Ofer Winter was just released by the army and kicked out, essentially. For years, he was put on ice and not promoted. Everyone knows he's the best there is. Everybody. But that's not the point. He's not an Osloist, and therefore he cannot be on the general staff. And he's just one outstanding example. There are many others, many other names which I did not recall offhand. People who have not been promoted over the years, and just recently, this current disastrous chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, who should be put on trial and hanged by the neck until dead for criminal negligence in every respect. But he thinks that it's his job at this point to promote and all the wrong people, and that's what he's been doing for the last few months. And it was his decision to let Ofer Winter go, and many others like him. So what's missing? What was missing in the ideology or the game plan of the Dati Leumi world, people like Rav Eli Sadan and this Mechina Kdam Tzva'it? What was missing was the understanding that we are in a war, not just an external war with an external enemy, but we have an internal enemy. And our aim has to be to overcome and overrun that enemy within Israeli society as well. I'm not talking about a majority of Israelis who are not Shomrei Shabbat, because that's not where most Israelis are. But that small but significant and extremely powerful, ruthless minority of regressive, woke, leftist, Maoist in some cases, in other cases, general anarchists or what have you, the kind of people who planned and executed that lovely happening, the Nova Festival, right on the border with Azar, complete with a statue of Buddha. Those people have successfully infiltrated all corridors of power in the country, and they will not allow Torah Jews to gain real power without a fight. And that, I think, that message has not, that fact has not truly been internalized by the Dati Leumi world. The Haredim don't need to hear that. They understood this all along. On the other hand, they have no solution, because they're in cave and desert mode, as we discussed. So they're not going to have any impact, and they don't plan to have an impact. Those who want to have an impact need to understand that these people are your enemy, just as those Amalekim over there are your enemy. And in some ways, they're more dangerous. So that's what's missing from most people's thinking. Of course, there are people who recognize this fact, but that is not the usual and standard approach in the Dati Leumi world, which is much too naive and and unwilling to recognize and deal with realities. By the way, it's not only the Dati Leumi world that is suffers from this malady. The Menachem Begin suffered from it as well. Menachem Begin came to power in Taushin Lamed Zayin, 1977. I remember I was in the country at the time already, and rather than truly shake up the entire government apparatus and bureaucracy and remove the Mapanikim and install Likudnikim, etc., he behaved in a completely irrational, irresponsible, naive fashion, and said that pretend like that we're talking about the British civil service, that you're professionals and you will work with the new government to promote its policies, as you did with the former government. And he just forgot one little thing, that you're not dealing with the British civil service, which, by the way, is no longer what the British civil service once was, so that it doesn't work there anymore either. But at one time it did work that way. You're dealing with communists, you're dealing with totalitarians, you're dealing with maniacal, regressive, woke lunatics. And even if you go back nearly 50 years to Begin coming to power, even if some of those terms were not yet in vogue, they were most certainly committed to preventing any government headed by Menachem Begin from actually ruling the country. Those are the facts. Were they aware of the facts at the time? I think not. Should they have been? Yes, they most certainly should have been. Not being aware of such facts is simply naivety and a lack of worldliness, not understanding, not knowing history. Of course, if you don't study history, you won't understand it. If you read it, you might understand it, and you might not. But if you don't read it, you'll never know. So, the people in Merkaz Arav, for example, I would recommend to them to get themselves an education, because the vast majority of those people are ignoramuses when it comes to history, sociology, and all things related to such matters. And if you wish to have an impact on society around you, then you need to know those things. If you don't, then perhaps you don't need to know them.
Rabbi,
Yes.
the proposed solutions to a lot of these problems that you've discussed have, a lot of them have elements where people work within the system, so to speak, to address its problems, like voting in a right-wing government, or voting in another right-wing government or something like that. But we know what it took the Maccabim to get rid of these evil people that were in power, and we see to what extent the system is corrupted. So I was curious what your thoughts are on how much can we work within the system in order to fight this war, as you say.
I would be for any plan, any way of changing the current reality, if I thought it had a real chance of success. Current reality is, in many ways, much more complex and convoluted than the reality that faced a majority of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Maccabim, the time of the Hashmonaim. I do not know how things will play out, but I am certain that if you're involved in a game, you're not going to win it unless you understand that you're in the game. If you're in a war, you're not going to win it unless you know that you're in a war. Then you have the option of planning and acting correctly, and studying tactics and military affairs, etc. But first you have to know that you're in a war. And the Dati Leumi world does not know. Most of it is not fully internalized, although this is changing because of events over the last many years. In fact, you could say the wiser and the quicker off the mark probably have understood this for 50 years or 40 years or 30 years. But certainly more recent events are forcing more and more people to very slowly, incrementally reach certain conclusions. How things will play out, I cannot tell you. It's impossible to know. But we certainly see that the regressives are unscrupulous in the extreme. They have no limits. And when fighting such an enemy, you must you too must change the scope and limits of your actions. You have to adopt a different approach. So let's complete this halacha. So we are here in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Perek Daled, halacha Yod Bet, Nichsei Sadikim Shebetocha. The property belonging to the righteous, to those who did not participate in this terrible crime of a Jewish city, turning to Avodah Zarah. وهم شعار يوشבי העיר שלא הודחו עם רובה נשרפים בכלל שללה. All their property, even though they're tzaddikim, is also destroyed in the general conflagration and destruction. הואיל וישבו שם, because they chose to live there. ממונם אבד, their money is forfeit. Anyone who in any way benefits from any of the property of such an irani dahath is to be punished. He has transgressed the mitzvah lo ta'aseh shene'emar v'lo yidbak biyadcha me'umma min achiram. Nothing of its property shall remain in your hand, even though it's very tempting. Lo yidbak, as if it attaches itself to you. You must shake yourself free of any attachment to any of these things. Now, Edim Zomamim are people who claim to have witnessed something, and it becomes apparent that they are lying, and they were actually somewhere else altogether, and they could not possibly have witnessed what they claim to have witnessed. So in Irani Dachat, there were witnesses who came to say this town is an Irani Dachat, and they themselves are Edim Zomamim, and they are speaking falsely. Kol ha'mahazik b'nechaseha zacha. Anyone who is able to benefit from any of this property, zacha, it is theirs to keep. Mutar or mutar le'anot bo shaharei huzmu. Walama zachaba, and why they have a right to this property. Shekol echad ve'echad kvar hifkir mamono misha'a shenichbar dina. So if the decision was reached that this is an irani dahat and all the property is forfeit, then all those people are mafkir. Their property, they assume now it's hefker, and now therefore a person who can be zochem min hefker, if that property is able to be appropriated legally by another person, they're being zochem min hefker and not taking someone else's property. One more statement, halakha yod gimel over here, or halakha heth, still, we'ena nivneth le'olam, and this town, this city is not to be rebuilt. Ever. And he who does so is hayav malkuyot, is to be flogged. Lo thibana od, it says in the Torah, should not be rebuilt. Umuta la'asotha ganoth ufardesim, but that land can be turned into a park or into orchards or fields. Shenema lo thibana od, lo thibana medina kamoth shahayata. It should not be rebuilt as a town as it once was, but for other. That land may be used for other purposes. We shall stop here for today. Ayu beruchim. Hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'me'achalim l'Adonai. Shalom u'nisachon.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.